Okay. All right, so without further ado, as they say, it's my very great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kirby Conrod. Kirby is a lecturer in linguistics at the University of Washington in Seattle. They're a syntactician and a sociolinguist, and work especially on the use of singular they, as it's called, to refer to a singular person. And Kirby is, in my opinion, one of a number of exciting rising linguists who combine expertise in what are traditionally quite distinct areas and are really able to move the field of linguistics forward as a result. And their research is really exciting and groundbreaking, and I think a lot of the value comes from the emphasis on the social effects, both of and on syntactic phenomena. And this work, I think, is especially important in the context of changing gender norms. For instance, one of the uses of they is by a person who doesn't identify as male or female, or it might be used to refer to someone for whom the speaker is unsure of their gender identity, in which case it could be perceived as an act of microaggression. Kirby also speaks about the importance of treating gender appropriately when it comes to incorporating it as a variable in research studies, in order not to cause harm to participants and to create scholarship that's valid and accurate. So I will stop talking now. I will hand over to Dr. Kirby Conrod for their talk, How to Do Things with Gender.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be virtually here. I'm also really excited to see a lot of people in attendance. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and then I'm going to try and make your little videos go away. And then I'm going to try and get the participants panel up so I can see if somebody raises their hand or uses the nonverbal communications. And then I have to move windows around a little bit, for which I apologize. So it does take a minute to set me up here. So doing slideshows in the Zoom. Oh my gosh, yes, okay. Can everybody see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you show me the little yes, no's in the participants pane? Yes, I can kind of see that people are saying yes. Awesome. So I am Kirby, and I am coming from the University of Washington to talk about sort of how to do things with gender. My title is a little bit of a play on the Speech Act theory sort of foundational text, How to Do Things with Words. But the idea is that I want to bring in ideas from Speech Act theory to apply directly to very inflectional sort of morphosyntactic features, and especially gender features, and show how people are actually using these morphosyntactic features that are at their disposal to do social activities. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what the talk outline is going to look like. So I'm first going to give you sort of a rundown of how I'm conceptualizing gender, and I'm going to detail Dr. Lauren Ackerman's sort of three-tiered model of gender in category theory. Lauren, you can tell me if I get it right. And then I'll be talking about the ways that gender exists in language and the ways that gender exists in the world. Once we sort of have that background established, I'm going to move towards looking at especially English uses of pronouns to talk about ways that especially LGBT, sorry, I've just found a typo in my slide. I'm fixing it in front of you. Nope. Nope. There we go. Sorry. Ways that LGBT communities use the sort of resources available in the English pronoun system to do a bunch of different work around communicating with gender features as sort of a main tool in the toolbox. And then I'm going to look a little bit at other languages and their use of morphosyntactic inflection, especially looking, sort of reviewing Berchtling's work in Hebrew with genderqueer and non-binary speakers of Hebrew, and then looking at some very, very new work in Spanish, looking at genderqueer and non-binary innovations in Spanish sort of morphosyntactic endings. Then I'll be sort of wrapping up with what the commonalities are between these systems and how we use them to accomplish communicative goals. So gender is in some ways a really tricky concept, and that's partially because we have used the same word to talk about phenomena in really different domains. So gender in the world can talk about stuff that we can kind of categorize as biosocial gender. I am borrowing this term from Ackerman 2019, and we're going to be using that as a sort of system, but so I'll give you more details on that framework. But biosocial gender is going to be this sort of umbrella term for gender identity, which is an internal sense of self. Gender roles, which are sort of ways that people's gender can give them trajectories to follow throughout their lives. Gender expression, which is going to be stuff about how we communicate our internal sense of self through symbolic and semiotic systems. And this can include linguistic and non-linguistic semiotic systems. So this is stuff like how you wear your hair and also how much you use creaky voice. And then biosocial gender is also going to be sort of part of the gender system that's in the world that includes sex. And I say watch out in this because I want to be careful not to propose that binary sex categories are empirically valid. They're not. But biosocial gender is partially constituted from things like sex assignment and many different sort of embodied sex characteristics. And I'll talk a little bit briefly about what I mean by sex assignment, and that's going to be something that's going to be very closely tied to linguistic behaviors. In language, the word gender has been used to mean essentially kinds of noun classes. So grammatical gender is a system of morphosyntactic inflection that can cause both concord and agreement. Concord is when there's grammatical gender that matches all the inflections in the same sort of domain syntactically. So if a noun is masculine and all its adjectives are masculine, we're going to call that concord. And then agreement is morphosyntactic inflection that matches outside of the domain of the noun. So if a noun is masculine and it's the subject of a verb and the verb has to take a masculine morpheme, we'll call that agreement. This is sort of more syntaxy than I'm actually going to get for the rest of the talk, but I just wanted to give you a highlight of the ways that grammatical gender gets really intercalated. That's not a real word. Really tied up in sort of the complexities of syntax. And then the other part of linguistic gender that we're going to want to talk about is notional gender. So this is sort of the linguistic expression of the idea of gender or the semantic gender. And this is something that may or may not sort of force concord and agreement in the syntax. And that seems to be a little bit more flexible. So I'm going to be talking about gender in the world and gender in language as being closely interrelated. And I want to use sort of a framework for thinking about this that Lauren Ackerman puts forward in terms of thinking in categories and exemplars, and then how those get coded into language. So I have a picture of pink and purple nerds. These are sour candy, and they are very small. And they come in usually, you can get a box with two colors in them, and if you dump them out on the table, they'll mostly sort of sort out in this distribution, but sometimes they'll get a little bit mixed up in the middle. So the exemplar tier is talking about real world phenomena, actual individuals that exist in the physical world. In our sort of nerds metaphor, the exemplar tier is going to be the actual nerds. And you'll notice that trying to sort out which nerds are the pink nerds and the purple nerds is actually kind of complicated. And so I'll go into sort of more details about this, but the exemplar tier is talking about each individual candy and its properties. The category tier is a sort of cognitive abstraction that's laid on top of the exemplars to try and fit the categories of types of nerds that there are. into what we've seen in the world. So we've seen, we've seen this complicated picture of there's like a bunch of nerds on a table, and the category tier is a little bit about trying to figure out how to simplify the way that we remember what kinds of nerds have what kinds of properties. So ideally, we want to be able to sort of draw a boundary between categories where on this side of the line, we have pink nerds, and on this side of the line, we have purple nerds. And then the feature tier is going to be the ways that those categories get encoded in language. And so this is either going to be encoded in semantic sort of lexical items, or it's going to be encoded in inflectional morphology throughout the morphosyntax. So the exemplar tier is any individual nerd, and the category tier is those groups of nerds. And what we get is these sort of morphosyntactic features of, you can say, okay, this word has a pink feature on it, or this word has a purple feature on it. Categorizing this way with nerds as with gender is not strictly straightforward. So there's obviously going to be issues. First of all, drawing the cutoff line. So this cutoff line that I have in the previous slide of like, okay, I'm going to draw a dotted line, and on the left of the line, all the nerds are pink, and on the right of the line, all the nerds are purple. Strictly speaking, this isn't technically true, even if you just look at my picture. And so looking at these sort of border areas, the cutoff line is something where it's going to be very difficult to draw a straight line that maximally separates the pink and purple nerds. Near the middle, they're kind of mixed in together. The other thing to notice is that even if you draw a really good cutoff line, there's a pink nerd on the purple side, and vice versa. So it's not the case that these nerds are completely cleanly separated. And when we think about this in ways of the way that gender maps onto gender as a system of categories maps onto gender as a system of exemplars, there's always going to be a pink nerd on the purple side, so to speak, where there's no formal definition of where you cut off gendered categories that cleanly and perfectly encapsulates what's going on with actual people's lives and bodies and situations. And you're also going to find sort of category internal variation. And so there's stuff like, what's going on with this dark pink nerd? Does this pink nerd that's near the border is much darker than the other pink nerds? Does it still count as a pink nerd? And so in some ways, simplistic, especially binary category systems are going to not totally explain the kinds of category internal variation that we see. And this is something that we want to watch out for. And then just in terms of linguistic expression, if I am having to mark all my nouns in terms of whether they are a pink or a purple, what grammatical form do I choose when I'm not sure what color the nerd is, or when it's on a side that I'm confused about? So we have this pink nerd on the purple side. Do I use the purple noun form for it, or do I use the pink noun form for it? And the same deal with this sort of atypical pink nerd. So to sort of map this metaphor back onto the kinds of gender that we can talk about grammatical gender, like nouns are going to be pink or purple based on things like semantic associations or morphophonological patterns or whatever. Semantic gender is going to be when you use lexical items to refer to people based on whether you think they are a pink or a purple person. And conceptual gender is going to be something where your ideas of pinkness and purpleness are related to certain ideas or people. So back to gender. I want to link this really explicitly with speech act theory and linguistic performativity and sort of the concept of gender performativity. And I'm going to give you a very brief sort of bare bones background of the theory behind that. So speech act theory is something that gets cited to Austin, which I've misspelled, I see, that's an I. Austin, how to do things with words. And essentially this piece is about the fact that there are many utterances that don't map cleanly onto something where I just am describing the world. They don't, strictly speaking, have truth conditions, but rather utterances are used to accomplish social goals, and a performative speech act is a speech act that does something in the world. So I do is a speech act that you can say under the right circumstances, and then you get to file taxes jointly with somebody. If you say it under the wrong tax circumstances, you don't get to do the tax thing. And so, you know, performative speech acts are highly contextually bound. But the idea is that it's not some extra linguistic thing that makes you become married. It's the fact that you said the words aloud and that you did the linguistic sort of performance of marriage. And it has legal consequences as well as sort of real life consequences. But the idea is that these kinds of performative speech acts are things that are constituting what's going on in our idea of the reality. And performative speech acts can also be used to bet, where you become having a financial obligation, or clicking I agree to the terms and conditions. This is a kind of speech act where you enter a legal contract by endorsing the sentence. And the reason that this applies to sort of gender theory, the way that this has been taken up in gender theory, is that the system of sociocultural and individual relationships that makes up gender is at least partially constructed out of these performative speech acts. So performative speech acts are things that create social consensus reality, and social consensus reality at least mostly encompasses biosocial gender and some parts of linguistic gender. So when somebody does a performative speech act like saying it's a girl, a bunch of stuff then happens to that human infant because somebody said those words. And if they said different words, a bunch of different stuff would happen to that human infant. And this is not, strictly speaking, just something that you impose on other people. You can also do it for yourself to some extent. So when I say my name is Kirby and my pronouns are they, them, in some ways I'm doing a performative speech act. I'm participating in creating my gendered social life. This is a collaborative process, so I'm not the only person in charge of deciding what my gender is. Everybody else has to collaborate with me to construct the sort of gendered location that I'm going to live in. Well, my circle is there first. That's okay. So one thing I want to caution people, and this is sort of a common myth, is that there's this common misreading, especially of Judith Butler's theory, where we can interpret saying gender is performative to mean gender is fake. And this is not strictly true. The idea is that performative speech acts have real world consequences that are social and legal. And it's not the case that we are inanimate candies that are just being sorted and categorized on a table. We are all collaborating in constructing this sort of consensus reality. And sometimes what this means is that certain speech acts can conflict with others, making a sort of a conflicting reality. Where's my, there we go. So I want to share this really, I really treasure this example. This is a screenshot from a social media website where somebody has sent a message to say that my girlfriend is an actual AMAB cis girl. They wrote male on her birth certificate by mistake. And I love this example because everybody's really friendly about it in responding. But I wanted to just sort of unpack what these terms mean and sort of show you the consequences of the speech act in some ways can be neutralized by other real world things. So AMAB stands for assigned male at birth, but cis means cis as in not transgender. So being a girl and being a cis girl, so not trans, but also being assigned male at birth essentially means what they're saying here of they wrote the wrong, big air quotes, the wrong sex assignment on the birth certificate. And so what this means is that under certain legal definitions, this person who has all the typical sex characteristics of people generally assigned female is legally being assigned male, but otherwise is apparently mostly being socialized and living her life as a woman. And so the joke of just kind of speed running the entire transition is that this infant got assigned male and then instantly mostly carried out life as a woman anyways, which I think is a really interesting example of the ways that gender has to be collaborative and cumulative, but the sort of legal consequences of certain performative speech acts get elevated in a certain way. So when we're talking about the way that performativity and speech act theory fit into the grammar, when I use the word the grammar, I'm talking about the internal series of unconscious rules. I'm coming from a background of generative syntax, which can help you understand some of the assumptions that I make about how grammar works. But essentially, we have to figure out, okay, these gender features are clearly very, very powerful and linked to important sort of ways that we navigate social relationships, but theoretically they also exist as part of the sort of neutral grammar that just spits out sentences. So premise one, and I think this is going to be mostly acceptable under the framework of exemplars and categories, is that morphosyntactic markers of gender that are in the grammar, which include both grammatical and semantic gender, are manifestations of features that are roughly based on categories, and the categories are roughly based on exemplars. So that's premise one, is sort of explaining where we fit in this three-tiered model of gender. And then premise two is speech acts can work to constitute the collaborative consensus reality. So if these are both true, then what this means is that using gender features is at least partially constituting the exemplar and category mechanism and behaviors around that. So we have sort of a feedback loop of you're learning through observing exemplars in the world, and you're learning how categories work as you see more exemplars, and you're mapping features onto those categories as you learn those categories. But using the linguistic features and hearing those linguistic features used around you are part of the exemplars that feed into your categories. And so we get this kind of feedback loop going where gender creates more gender. So when you use a mask, my pink nerd is this lovely pink color. When you use a masculine or a feminine feature, what you're doing is you're feeding more data back into the nerd categorizing algorithm. And in some ways, what that means is that individual speakers actually have a lot of power to influence how that algorithm works in general in the sort of larger community by deploying those features in strategic ways. So the evidence that I'm going to present for you is going to come from the most sophisticated gender language users that there are, which are gay people, feminists, trans people, and drag queens. There's some overlap of these groups. But the data that I'm going to present to you in English are mostly sort of pragmatic examples of ways that people deploy these grammatical gender features, sort of debatably grammatical. They might be semantic in English, but they're deploying these linguistic gender features to influence the gender sorting algorithm, essentially. So I'm going to show you examples of ways that you can either include or exclude gender information strategically, for example, to avoid coming out at work. You can exclude gender information routinely, for example, to avoid implicit sexist biases. You can change the gender information to meet someone's expectation. So this, for example, can be used to avoid transphobic discrimination. You can also change the gender information that you're using to express your feelings, which I'll give you some examples of ways that people do that. So one of the oldest that I know of examples for the use of singular they to refer to a specific person, and I'm still hunting down the older attestations of this use. But one of the oldest uses of singular they that I'm personally aware of is using they to refer to your gay partner to avoid outing yourself, or manipulating pronoun features intentionally. And this is colloquially sometimes called the pronoun game. This is referenced in popular media sometimes, but the pronoun game is any use of pronouns to obscure the person's identity, especially when you're trying to keep private your gay personal life when you're in a sort of a straight business setting. So I have two examples here. One is from a lesbian CEO, I think, I would have to double check this book, who talks about, you know, being a lesbian largely doesn't intrude on my business relationships, but in personal conversations at lunch, I play the pronoun game, which is where I avoid pronouns completely to talk about my partner, my friend, the person I live with, to not out yourself as a gay person in this business setting, which is assumed to be a heterosexist setting. And we have lots of examples of this, but I love examples that specifically include singular they, that's sort of getting emphasized. So for this second example is an example of an anonymous gay man on a blog talking about when you're not completely out yet, you're gay, and someone asks you what kind of woman you're attracted to. And your response is along the lines of, oh, they, and this is their capitalization, they have to have a wonderful personality and humor and spontaneity. And this is something where anecdotally, I think a lot of people can sort of relate to the experience of using they and your interlocutor going on to continue assuming a binary gender anyways, and maybe not the binary gender that you intended. So concealing gender is something where you can do this by essentially intentionally withholding specific information in grammatical markings on your pronouns. So this is something that you can do in languages besides English as well, but these are the examples that I sort of have to bring to the table on terms of what I think of as very early sort of closet pronouns. Oops. The other sort of tool that you can use pronouns for is to de-emphasize gender, especially when gender is an axis on which there are significant sort of oppressions or prejudice. So feminists' critiques of generic he, also called the epicene he or the generic masculine, contend that masculine grammatical forms, for example, he, are not actually generic. And when we've used he in a sentence with no other gender information, that he introduces gender information in a way that biases people towards assuming either masculine sort of defaultness or erasing women's identities in general. And so feminist critiques of generic he, and this is something that is empirically really verified. When people see a sentence like one, anyone can achieve his dreams if he believes in himself, they really do think of a man. They're not thinking of just any kind of person. Whereas when somebody sees a sentence like two, anyone can achieve their dreams if they believe in themselves, there's less of this bias introduced. Singular they is something where it's been used in English in the way that we see into for a very, very long time. And it's been essentially in free variation with he, where he and they have been mostly both options. But as English has moved away from sort of the vestiges of grammatical gender and towards more of a semantic gender system, using he takes on a lot more of a social gendered meaning. The other sort of activity, social activity that you can do with pronouns is, so English morphologically marks gender on third person singular pronouns. And third person reference, anytime that you refer to a third person necessarily it's called third person because you're setting up a triangle with three participants. You have the speaker who is saying the words, you have the addressee who is being addressed, and if we were talking about them, we would usually use second person, so we would say you. And then we have a third person who we're talking about, the referent. So if the speaker and the addressee agree about the gender, then there's not going to be a problem. I see one more typo. I'm sorry, I'm finding these typos in front of you. There we go. That one was semantically important, so I wanted to fix it. So if the speaker and the addressee agree about the gender of the person that they're talking about, there's not going to be a problem. So if my spouse says to me that Miss Toes ate her dinner last night, Miss Toes is our cat, and I've put a little subscript R to indicate Miss Toes is the referent here. Neither the speaker, Hayden, nor the hearer, Kirby, are the person being referred to. It's Miss Toes, the cat. And we use she, her pronouns for Miss Toes because she's a little lady. She has very strong little cat gender. I feel very strongly about this. However, if the speaker and the addressee don't agree on the gender of the referent, then there might be a conflict. So if you're taking your dog for a walk in the before times when we were allowed to take our dogs for walks recreationally and interact with dogs, if a stranger says to my friend Allison, your dog is so cute, what's his name? What this indicates to us is that the stranger has decided that the dog is a boy. Allison's opinion is that the dog is a girl. And so Allison tends to use she, her pronouns for this dog, who is named Cleo, and she's a beautiful brindle greyhound. Now Allison has to decide whether to accommodate the stranger, and the stranger has to decide whether to accommodate Allison's expectations, essentially. So the fact that Allison and the stranger have different opinions on the sort of pronouns that we should assign this particular dog, we now have to have some sort of social negotiation and decide who has to accommodate whom. I don't know if you personally have experience with having had a conversation where two participants were using different pronouns for the same person, but it feels really uncomfortable to keep doing that without one person eventually sort of accommodating to the other person. And this is something that tends not to happen very frequently in gender normative situations because it is so uncomfortable. So Allison has to decide, okay, what does she do when this stranger misgenders her dog? There's non-accommodation strategies and there's a couple accommodation strategies. One non-accommodation strategy is don't correct them, but just use whatever you'd normally use. So yeah, I'll talk about your dog saying, oh yeah, her name is Cleo, but not mention it. Another non-accommodation strategy is to say, actually, she's a girl, and correct them on this sort of presupposition error that they've made. An accommodation strategy, if Allison doesn't want to cause conflict with the stranger, is to just not mention it, but not use any pronouns to avoid gender or pronouns in talking about the dog. Or Allison has the other accommodation strategy of don't mention it, but just use whatever the strangers use. Just say like, okay, I guess my dog is he, him now for this interaction. Each strategy has to take into account a bunch of different factors. So one is that some people may feel like calling your dog the wrong pronoun is unkind to the dog. Another factor is you don't want to let the stranger continue with a mistaken understanding of the dog's gender or sex. You don't want to get into an argument with a stranger. You don't want to confuse the stranger by switching without saying anything. So all of these different factors are going to be sort of variably ranked depending on which ones you think are most important. And I'm curious, and I sort of wrote in a little bit of audience participation. But I'm curious if anybody feels like calling a female dog who is normally called she, her pronouns, if you call the dog he, is it doing unkindness to the dog? And I would be fascinated if you used your little yes, no votes in the Zoom to say, are we being mean to the dog if we misgender the dog? I see some yeses and some nos, some mixed results. What about if instead of a dog, it's a toddler? Does that change your answer? So many people are saying, yes, that changes my answer. I would love to sort of follow up on this discussion in the Q&A session. I'm concerned about time, so I want to push forward. But I think, you know, this is something that's intriguing to talk about, where and I see that the chat is filling up with answers, but I'll visit those in a minute. I have too many windows going on, sorry. So if misgendering a dog is okay, but misgendering a toddler is not, what's the difference? And if misgendering a dog and a toddler are mostly okay, but misgendering an adult human companion is not, then obviously I want to talk about what's the difference there. We have this strong sense that misgendering is something where it's a kind of social, you know, faux pas, and it sort of variably applies. Oops, my mouse. So without sort of totally answering that question for you, I would sort of want to review what these data tell us. Performative speech acts mean that speech acts do something to social consensus reality. When you use a pronoun about a dog or a toddler or an adult human, part of what you are doing is contributing to the social consensus reality. In the same way that using they to avoid outing yourself in homophobic contexts, you let people come to their own conclusions without having to lie. Using they to counteract sexist generic language removes gender information to ideally weaken the association of male as a default person. And using he or she to refer to somebody, especially when interlocutors have different ideas about the referent, you have to choose how to solve a conflict, because this can introduce essentially an issue where you and your interlocutor can have different ideas about what kind of person your dog is or toddler. So all the instances that I've given you so far have been not debating the actual characteristics of any particular person or exemplar. We're not trying to figure out what gender the person is or the dog. We're trying to figure out how to talk about the person or the dog or the nerd. In a grammar where pink and purple are marked on a functional element, so talking about gender endings or pronouns, people don't even notice what they used sometimes. It's frequently totally unconscious. But English has this new and growing option of simply referring to a nerd without using either pink or purple. So singular they, referring to a specific person, is talking about a nerd without giving you any gender information, essentially. But failing to specify what color nerd you're talking about can also be informative through what information you're choosing not to include. So I'm going to sort of talk about this in terms of optionality or intentionality. When you have more options about nerds besides just pink or purple, when you now have the option of calling yourself a nerd without specifying, that means anytime you do use a feature like purple, it's actually technically optional, which means that every time you use purple, it takes on more implied meaning. So I'm using purple or I'm using masculine because it's important to the person I'm talking about, or because it's relevant to the conversation, or it's because it's important to me, the speaker, or to you, the addressee. Or, and this one I like, I used purple because purple is my favorite color and I like it. Which is a weird thing to apply to gender, maybe, but it turns out that this does actually happen. So I used purple because it's my favorite color and I like it. totally does apply to the gender metaphor. So I'm going to be giving you examples from RuPaul's Drag Race because they're less depressing than the other misgendering examples. But essentially, gender morphology can be used to express how you feel about a person, not just how you feel about what category they belong in, but how you feel about them just in general. So the examples I bring you are from season 9 of RuPaul's Drag Race, which is a reality TV show where drag queens compete to be really good at the performance and art of doing drag. And the first contestant eliminated in season 9 is James Mansfield. And what I find so interesting about this, you know, in an elimination reality TV show, being eliminated first is obviously bad. And we have these examples of judges using he and she at different points when talking about the same person. So we have examples like, we're actually rooting for James and want him to shine, but he's going to have to believe in himself. So we have all these, you know, he in this sentence. And we also have judges using she. So James's audition tape was so funny, I got it. But I think since she's been in this competition with the other girls, she's been thrown off. So what are the differences between the sentence? Why are the judges using he sometimes and she other times to talk about the same person? And one sort of hypothesis that we could consider is maybe he means the performer and she means the character. This is something where sometimes drag pronouns are talking about the character and the performer in different ways. But this is mostly not the case. So the examples that I've included are both about James's performance in the competition. He is connected to more judgment and doubt, whereas she is connected to sympathy and rooting for an underdog. So essentially, in this sort of local context, I'm going to go back because I love this GIF. In this sort of local context of a queer setting and a reality TV show setting where gender markers are going to be optional and sort of flexible no matter what, they take on these additional meanings that are local just to the reality TV show sort of universe. Essentially, if semantic gender markers in English are optional, then the optionalness means we can deploy these markers for other meanings besides what category do I think this person is in. So if you're studying linguistics, I encourage you to start listening for words like he or she applied to things that aren't men or women, like boats or animals or countries. Or I have a professor who only refers to nodes in a syntax tree as certain gendered pronouns. It's very fascinating. And I also encourage you to start listening to the way that gender gets used by people, not just famous drag queens on a TV show, but people who are working in a different system that's not really about categories, but is more about expression. And the meanings are sort of up for local debate. And I just made the chat my whole screen. It's okay. Okay, so I'm going to really quick wrap up with discussions of things that aren't English because so much of this research has been about English and I'm sick of it. So I want to talk about ways that people can do essentially the same kinds of social activities using grammatical gender as a system of noun classes. And ways that people are using that system to accomplish their sort of gender goals. Click. So my first example is this beautiful chapter from Birchling 2014, where they interviewed 6 Hebrew speakers who self-identified as genderqueer, gender fluid, or non-binary, or these sort of related non-binary umbrella term genders. And this is so interesting because Hebrew has 2 grammatical genders, M or F, or sort of masculine or feminine. There's not a neuter. And it marks speaker gender on the verb in certain contexts, which if you're non-binary, what it feels like, according to some of Birchling's interview data, is that it feels like the grammar is trying to force you to misgender yourself. So the strategies that these speakers used were a few very, very interesting strategies. One was avoidance. So a speaker only speaks in present tense, never uses future tense, meaning that they would just never use verb tense that would require gender marking. Another speaker used alternating between masculine and feminine markings on every other verb. So in the interview transcript, it's really quite impressive how regular they are of like, okay, this verb is masculine, this verb is feminine, and they're really, every single one is alternating. And then the oppositional use of a speaker using the marking that essentially doesn't align with their assigned sex at birth. So a speaker in this data set who uses consistently masculine markings and is assigned female at birth uses that grammar as a way to sort of complicate their general presentation and expression of gender. So in using any of these strategies, Birchling speakers are adding a layer of expressive or implied meaning on top of what they're talking about. Avoiding or alternating or sort of opposing gender marking means that every single utterance is a performative speech act that is creating their gender. And this is true of basically any gendered speakers, but trans speakers of any language often feel like they're defined by opposition. To be trans is to disagree with what the people around you feel about the sort of consensus reality. And it's really sort of a reminder that consensus reality is not a unitary or objective thing, and speakers can claim agency by voicing a minority position. All right, I have like 2 more slides, and I'm a little over time, sorry. The other example, oh no, it's like 10 speakers. I'll put that information in the slide when I send it to you again. Papadopoulos has this beautiful thesis and related talk, which I can give you the citations for, interviewing a bunch of Spanish speakers using elicitation tasks that are targeted towards ungendered, gender neutral, and specifically genderqueer markings on nouns or adjectives. And Spanish marks grammatical gender on nouns and nominal modifiers, but not on verbs or whatever. So these can apply to first, second, or third person reference. And Papadopoulos's elicitation task mostly uses third person reference. But the strategies that the speakers used were to either use existing binary endings, either in isolation or doubling up. And so some speakers would say the O and A endings, avoiding gendered endings or avoiding gender, sort of semantic gender in general. So talking about a person or a group rather than talking about a gendered word like man or woman, and using prodrop, which is a feature of Spanish, also was a way to avoid using gendered pronouns. And then the other strategy that's so fascinating to me is that some speakers in Papadopoulos's study actually used these innovative forms, which have only been anecdotally reported, but it's nice to have sort of formal attestations of instead of having the O or the A, the masculine or the feminine ending nouns and adjectives in the A, this little A, or E or X, and also a novel pronoun, ella. Oops, come on. So the common strategies that I want to sort of identify between Birchling's speakers and Papadopoulos's speakers are that both groups of speakers used avoidance to strategically complicate the gender scenario. And this means either using prodrop or circumlocution or avoiding entire verb tenses. And both groups avoided gendered lexical nouns. And then the other strategy was using or mixing existing binary forms. So either using both types of sort of noun endings in Spanish or alternating between verb endings, verb markings in Hebrew. And then the innovations found in sort of Papadopoulos's study are so interesting to me, in part because of the sort of limitations of the innovation and how people will work within the limitations of the grammar of their language. So the sort of most pronounceable endings in the novel Spanish forms included endings in E and E, which in part is very popular because it's based on analogy with existing noun classes. And I'm going to skip the rest of this slide based on time. But what these strategies accomplish is that you can use implicatures the same way that avoiding gender in English does, where you can de-emphasize gender when it's not relevant. You can avoid misgendering, you can avoid outing somebody. And alternation strategies are so interesting because they use the power of accumulation of consensus reality. So if a person isn't a pink or a purple nerd, but is instead some sort of pinkish, purplish, striped nerd, or if they are sort of have properties of both and don't want to be really lumped into one or the other category, using alternating forms as a way of sort of accumulating a bunch of different exemplars, linguistic exemplars, and what you get is sort of a heterogeneous picture of what kind of person that is. And then the innovation strategies are sort of maximally expressive because they're not mistakable for something that's neutral or de-emphasized. And essentially, innovation in these grammars is saying, I'm not a pink or a purple nerd, I'm a totally different flavor. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much. I'm going to show you one more slide and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen. My one more slide is that I have some paper topics for you, which you can ask about during my Q&A. And then I have my further reading list. I'm going to get out of full screen here. And should I stop my share or just?
You might want to refer to it when people ask questions. So.
Okay, I'll keep it up, but not in the slideshow view so I can see the chat and stuff.
Yes, good idea. Okay, thank you very much, Kirby. That was a really fantastic, really fascinating talk. So we'll take questions now. So as I say, if people want to ask a question, I know some people will have to go in, maybe have to go in 5 minutes because they've got something else to do on the next hour, so that's fine. But if you do want to stay for questions, we can stay for as long as people like. Thank you, people that are saying thank you in the chat. Thank you for coming. I just want to point out, while people are thinking of their questions and formulating them, that a couple of people have put things in the chat. So if you haven't got that open, have a look. So Joe Keller, who has now gone, has put a reference in there about Hebrew invented non-gendered grammatical. I don't know, and she doesn't say pronouns. I was going to say pronouns, but it's not. But anyway, there's a reference in there. And JR has also just put something else in there as well. And to start us off, while people are either typing their questions or thinking of them and raising their hands, I thought I'd ask an easy one. So something else that I noticed that Joe Keller put in the chat earlier on, when you asked about dog pronouns, they said that they didn't necessarily think it mattered, but that their friend uses they for their dog. Which is and
I think it's very cute. I really like the way that people are sort of, so the nice thing about pets is that the dog does not know about grammar or pronouns or gender marking at all. And so what I think is really interesting is the way that people will use dogs or pets in general as sort of somebody that's part of your social world enough that it makes sense to assign them gender, but they're not part of your social world enough that they're going to object to whatever you assign them. And so I have heard sort of anecdotes about people using they pronouns for a pet as a way to intentionally practice using singular they to make it feel more like part of their grammar, which I think is so fascinating. And, I think that also, the sort of way that people just decide the gender of their pet, which sometimes aligns with the pet's assigned sex at birth, but not always, is really interesting because pets are these sort of quasi-social entities in our social world.
Yeah, and the other thing with animals I was sort of thinking as well is, not normally with pets because we normally do anthropomorphize them or whatever, but animals can be its, which is something we wouldn't normally do for people, but that some people can do for babies. And I think whether you can do it with babies correlates a lot with how much you like babies, but some people definitely can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I would be interested if people wanted to vote in the chat. Can you call babies it? A lot of people are saying yes. I'm not seeing anybody say strongly no. Yeah, so some people feel uncomfortable calling babies it, but the idea I think that's sort of underlying that is that like a young enough baby is sort of pre-social and isn't part of your social fabric. It's sort of like a nice little potato that you have to take care of so that it turns into a person. This is a weird sort of philosophical way to talk about a human infant, and people feel very strongly when they feel like um, they have a personal social relationship. The other thing that somebody's pointing out in the chat that I appreciate is that there are many adult people, some who identify as trans and some who don't, who actually specifically prefer using it pronouns. This is something where it's kind of controversial because it's also sort of generally agreed upon that calling somebody it when they haven't specifically asked for it is really insulting and dehumanizing. But if somebody uses it as their pronoun that express as part of their gender identity and expression, then using anything else counts as misgendering. So it's kind of an interesting complication because people have really strong feelings about it.
Yeah. Philippa has a hand up, so I'm going to unmute her so that she can ask her question, and then we have another one after that.
Thanks, Laura. Can you hear me, Kirby?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. It's not so much a question, but it is an observation. When you were talking about toddlers, when my daughter was a baby, I didn't want to buy into the whole pink and blue thing, which is what many people do. So I would quite often just dress her in fairly neutral coloured clothes, and people would always assume she was a boy. And so people would say, "Oh, what's your little boy called?" And I found as a mother, I did find it quite hard, and I wanted to say, "But she's, why do you think she's a boy? She's not a boy, and she doesn't look like a boy." And in the end, I started putting her in pink clothes so that people wouldn't keep asking me that question. And I hated doing that because I really don't agree with the whole pink and blue thing. It's just got worse as years have gone on.
Yeah.
But it is as a parent, it is weird when somebody misgenders your child or makes an assumption about your child, which isn't true.
I'm curious if your daughter, especially sort of pre-full sentences, had any opinions to express of her own about being misgendered.
Well, I think certainly at that age, I mean, she was probably about 1, and so no, she didn't. But I think she did. Yeah, I think children, they do grow up very, very aware of those social norms, and she did question it a lot.
It's definitely something so interesting because children are working on collecting their exemplars and sort of constructing their categories and then figuring out, okay, people are clearly using these features in a way that is related to the categories, but I don't know what the sort of qualifying dimensions the categories are constructed on yet. And so I get some really interesting anecdata about little kids deciding how gender works. I have one story about a child, I think like 3 or 4, who observed that, okay, mommies are called she and daddies are called he. Mommy wears glasses. My mommy wears glasses. My daddy does not wear glasses. And therefore, people who wear glasses are she. And people who don't wear glasses are he. And I think it's so interesting to sort of see how young children go through these stages of trying to figure out what the categories are based on, because it's clearly not something that's obvious or inherent, where people can just sort of figure it out with no information about how the social world works. I think the other thing that's really interesting is what would happen if you just sort of didn't correct people. And I know a few people are sort of starting to raise their children this way, where they will primarily use they for the young child, and also not correct other people about pronouns, and just sort of see what happens. And I think this is very interesting because on some level, there's not really a lot of practical reason to be really stringent about enforcing how strangers gender your 2 or 3-year-old, unless you think that strangers are going to be doing a certain kind of gender socialization to your 2 or 3-year-old that you don't approve of. And I think that's very interesting to sort of think about. But sort of my experience with young children is that they start to get strong opinions about gender around kindergarten. and this is what Lauren Ackerman is saying in the chat right now, ages 3 to 5 are about when people are acquiring this. Yeah. And I don't know of enough sort of early developmental and language acquisition research that's looking at acquisition of gender as a cognitive category and a linguistic category and trying to sort of unconfound them. There's a hand up in the...
Yeah, and then Martina, if you want to ask your question.
Yes. Yeah, I hope everyone can hear me, but yeah, thank you very much for the talk. This is great. I have, it's technically 2 questions, but they're basically just like, is there bibliography on this /
Sure, yeah.
Can you share? And so there were 2 things that were mentioned in the talk and then in the discussion that sort of are interesting. And one of them is actually the use of it for people, so specifically highly animate reference. And whether there was something, like there were any studies or anything that look at this linguistically in terms of how animacy interferes with the whole gender dynamic. And the other question about that, the other question is just, you mentioned briefly at some point that speakers tend to not process gender markers that they're using or are used, or rather like not pay attention to them. And this is something that has happened to me, as in I'm a native speaker of Italian that marks gender on nouns and modifiers. And I've had people talk to me using, like 2 different people talk to me at the same time using, one of them was using masculine modifiers and the other was using feminine modifiers, and they weren't hearing each other. Like they weren't accommodating because they simply weren't realizing that they were using different markers. So I was wondering sort of what the data is about that sort of thing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. These are really great questions. I cannot currently answer the question about using it for adult humans in sort of linguistic studies about that. I think that the times that I have seen it, it has only ever been as a way of sort of like really violently misgendering specifically like a specific subcategory of trans people. I would suspect that any research is going to end up being about that. And I think that there's this sort of interesting sort of symbolic uptaking of the idea that it is for inanimates or non-human reference as a way of like really like sort of obviously dehumanizing a referent. In terms of people sort of not noticing what gender markers they're using, I think it's so interesting because this also, like, I would think that in English people would know what pronouns they were using because pronouns are sort of more, like slightly less, if there's a scale of like the most functional to the most lexical, they're like kind of over here, whereas like inflectional endings on nouns are really inflectional. And so I'm not surprised to hear that people were using different endings without noticing, but I am surprised when it happens in like English pronouns. But I think it really drives home the fact that people, there's this whole grammatical operation going on in the background that people don't attend to on purpose unless they are trying to. And there's a little bit of work on processing, but where is it here? This one, no, this one, no. I have, yes. So there was a CUNY talk just last month about sort of slowdowns of novel morphemes in Spanish that you know did really trip people up. But I think that it's interesting because this is not something where we're testing like alternations necessarily, but we're testing sort of these novel innovative endings instead. And I think that there needs to be more work done on this.
Does anybody else want to ask a question? Particularly, I know there's a few students who are in the audience. If you want to take the opportunity to ask Kirby any questions about, you know, where you could go if you wanted to learn more about this or study it further, then please do ask those questions. Samsung Galaxy S7 Edge has a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. This is my first time using Zoom, sorry. So I've found this talk really interesting, and thank you for putting it on. My main point that I wanted to make was, in English law, the word he and the pronoun he and male pronouns are used to refer to people. And although it says he cannot commit a crime, for example, it doesn't specifically refer to males, it refers to all people. And that is, I assume that comes from the fact that in Old English, man was used to refer to humans as a species as opposed to a specific male gender. But do people still feel that by using he in English law is problematic?
So yes. Yes, and there's this whole literature on the way that pronouns get taken up in sort of legal scholarship. I'm not a legal scholar, and so I can only sort of very vaguely say that, yes, this is an issue. I can say that the issue of a person's legal gender is something that is mostly established via case law and family law. As a way of codifying common law. It's really a thorny issue and tends to be around the legality of certain marriages. But the issue with pronouns in particular is fascinating because there have been instances where legal arguments have been made as a way to sort of have their cake and eat it too. So he applying to all people, meaning like he should not do a crime, legally, especially in English law that I know of, has been saying, yes, okay, women are not like legally allowed to just do whatever crime. But when suffragists used that same argument to say, okay, well, if he applies to everybody, we should be able to vote then. The argument was, no, he for voting only means the man's. And so what I will tell you is that law is more fake than most language. But I think it's a really interesting issue how the way that sort of linguistic social meaning gets encoded in this incredibly imperfect sort of attempt at formalizing law. So the whole issue of gender in legal scholarship is its own total field that can be studied, and that's as much as I kind of know about it.
Thank you for answering that. I thought that was interesting. I find it interesting that it still uses he, meaning people as a species as opposed to.
Yeah, and this is something where occasionally there are debates of like, should we change all these? And there are debates about this in languages with even more grammatical gender stuff going on too, where it's codified into law. So yeah, it's definitely very interesting.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm going to unmute Rufus now if you'd like to ask your question. Oh, we can't hear anything.
Hello?
Yes, that's better.
Hello.
Is that better? Hello, I'm Isaac. So I just wanted to ask if we could like talk on how they can be used instead of like a progressive, but as like a misgendering tool. So I'm a trans guy, my pronouns are he, him, and so if someone was to use they, that would be misgendering me. So yeah.
So if it is the case that they as a pronoun doesn't have any like gender features, leaving a gender feature out can be a way of sort of implying that the gender feature wouldn't be appropriate to use, which is a way of sort of covertly misgendering. And so some of my own research, and if you follow up with me, I can send you actual like papers on this, but some of my own research on misgendering, I had instances where people did use they to essentially sort of covertly misgender binary trans people, and this was applied to trans men and women, and it didn't happen to any cis people in my study. Except one fictional cis person one time, where somebody referred to like a film character as they once and then switched to she. And so I think it's the fact that this gains meaning as a kind of misgendering is sort of misgendering through implying that he wouldn't be appropriate. And it's definitely something where it is a way of sort of hiding your transphobia in certain ways, or misgendering by implication, but it's still just as linked to sort of taking away trans people's agency over their own lives. And so you're right that it's misgendering, but also I think that it's misgendering through omission, and it sucks. And I'm sorry if it happens to you. I'm sorry. And also, like, this is something that simply does not happen to cis people at anywhere near the rate that it happens to trans people. So it's definitely linked towards people's sort of ideas about the validity of somebody's gender roles or gender position.
Yeah.
Kate in the chat is bringing up a case of a teacher who refused to gender a trans pupil at all. So the teacher appealed against a disciplinary procedure. I actually know which one this is, and if somebody finds the link, there was a teacher who said, I don't want to use this person's pronouns, so I'm only going to use their name. And the teacher was, I think, warned for that, but wasn't strictly speaking misgendering the person. And so he didn't get in trouble. And the reason that he did actually get disciplined was that he sort of slipped up and did actually misgender somebody while trying to avoid pronouns. Because as it turns out, avoiding pronouns for 9 months at a time is really hard.
Yes, or when people say that they don't use pronouns and you're like,
you do. Yeah, that's not true.
I'm going to unmute Linnea now, who has a question.
Sure.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes. Hi. I have a group of friends that refer to everyone as they. Thoughts on that?
Do they stop when somebody objects?
I'm not entirely sure. I've not really seen anyone overtly object.
So this is something interesting. So if they are really doing it to everybody, and if they're doing it, if you can sort of, and this would be something where if you're looking for a linguistic study and your friends are game for this, this would be a really great sort of small sort of ethnographic study that somebody could do of like, okay, my group of friends here says that they use they for everyone. I am going to try and get a bunch of data of them hanging out and gossiping, and I'm going to check, are they really doing it for everyone? Are they doing it more for certain groups of people than for others? Are they reacting in certain ways when people say, hey, I don't like that? That would be something that would be really interesting to follow up on, because sort of, you know, I'm in a situation where most of my social network is trans and non-binary people. And so, you know, we certainly use they at a much higher frequency than I think the sort of general population. But there's also instances where it's like, you know, it's really important to this person that we use she for her. And so I think recognizing that within the sort of social fabric of that group, it would be interesting to see how the in-group norms are constructed. But that sounds like a really rich sociolinguistic study. You should do that.
Maybe.
Study your friends, write a paper.
Okay, does anybody else want to raise their hand? This comment just gone into the chat room.
Lauren in the chat has a question about my PhD thesis having dyadic conversation between friends where this happens. And the answer is that, yes, I actually did have a pair of participants who only ever used they to refer to anybody. But I think that was partly because the people were kind of cagey about not accidentally de-anonymizing their friends. And so this is something where they were intentionally, there's some talk in the interview about they were intentionally not wanting to reveal the identity of their friends, and that may have been a factor.
We do that in exam boards all the time, actually, where, you know, we're talking about a student, and I mean, sometimes we don't know who it is because it's anonymous, but sometimes we do know, and we very deliberately use they.
Yeah.
You know, to be clear that we are definitely being anonymous.
Yeah. There's another hand up.
Eleni, I will just unmute you. There you go.
Yeah, hi, Kirby. I mean, my interest is in cases where the community tries to construct a new pronoun, because, for example, I'm thinking of Greece, where there really isn't an appropriate non-binary gender-neutral pronoun. The only thing that has been used by non-binary people is the equivalent of it, but that has many problems, like we were saying, about no inanimacy. So I was wondering, like, how hard it is, if there are studies that show whether it's hard for a community to adopt a completely novel word, or the opposite, whether it's easy or whether it's something that can work.
So the studies that exist, I've brought this slide up, so I encourage all of you to go to my little bibliography here. The studies that exist that look at novel forms aren't really sort of developed enough where we can start comparing how hard it is across communities. We can only kind of hypothesize, but it's really hard to test those hypotheses at this juncture. There is, so this CUNY talk here, where is it? Oh no, it's missing. The CUNY talk, that I cited here, which is in my bibliography, my longer bibliography as well, looked at actually comparing different novel forms and how hard they were by looking at processing and self-paced reading. And I think probably the psycholinguistics methodologies are going to be the best ways to actually test some of our ideas about what is hard or easy about using new forms. But what they found in this study was that the two new forms, one of which is pronounceable and one of which theoretically isn't, weren't significantly different in the slowdowns that they caused. So A endings and X endings were both sort of equally slowing down people in self-paced reading tasks. The other reason that I want to plug this link here, so this is a crowdsourced, slightly annotated bibliography that I sort of curate. If people have, I don't think we have anything in Greek yet. So if people have papers or even just articles that are not scholarly articles, but stuff that would help somebody trying to write a scholarly article, I really encourage you to add this to this Google Doc here, because it is such a new sort of field of study that I really want us to cooperate to try and make sure that we can find each other's work, basically. So no, I don't know. And if you find something out, can you put it in our Google Doc so that we can share it with people?
Yeah, sure. Can I say, since I also think it's really interesting, like you said, for the writing, that so in Greek, what has happened is using the at symbol, like the email at symbol at the end, because everything is gendered, so morphological endings are gendered, using that in the end.
Yeah,
and this is something of words too. Yeah.
This is something, we have it commented in Spanish that people do this in Spanish too.
In Spanish
using
with the
at
symbol.
Beth, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about what thoughts you had in regards to biosocial gender relating to what pronouns you use. So I've heard it might be a bit controversial, because I've heard a lot of people are really there's a lot of debate about it, but people who identify as lesbians using he, him pronouns, and about some people who, for pronouns, it's really important. So for example, if you are trans, I can see why using pronouns would be more, perhaps more important maybe than if you're cis. And then, but people, kind of that relation to that, I thought that was really interesting, if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so in the chat, the sort of foundational text to read about sort of lesbian pronoun practices is reading Stone Butch Blues and sort of related texts. But the thing that I think it's important to remember is that sexuality is part of the way that people incorporate sexual identity or sort of sexual orientation into their gender identity and expression. And so for a lot of people, and I think this is especially true for people who are he, him lesbians, this sort of category of people who are lesbians that use he, him pronouns in some or all domains of their life. It's especially important to remember that for these people, frequently the category lesbian is not a subcategory of like a larger category of woman, but actually sort of an adjacent category in some ways. And frequently what will happen is that you'll sort of find people talking about like what I think sometimes people will call microgenders, but the idea that rather than having a system in your mind where there are two major binary categories, you have like 8 or 9 categories that are not exhaustive. And for those people, one of the ways that you can express a non-normative sort of gender position in the world is by doing stuff that appears to conflict. So identifying yourself as a lesbian but using he, him pronouns is something that is kind of in some ways similar to the Hebrew speakers who are using the endings that are oppositional to their birth assignment as a way of saying, okay, well, for every pink nerd that somebody puts in the jar, I'm going to also put a purple nerd in the jar so that I have this nice mixed jar of ways that people talk about me. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you.
Yeah, and lots of people are sharing beautiful links in the chat. So thank you for those of you sharing resources in there. Definitely follow up on the links that they're sharing.
Yeah, I've saved the chat, so I'll try and make that available somewhere as well. I think we nearly ran out of time, but I'll just take Amelia's. Oh, she's vanished. Amelia, if you want to ask your question, feel free. I'll unmute you. There you go.
Sure, thanks. Hey, Kirby. This was awesome, and I was really interested in what you were saying about how as a third option becomes more available and more frequently used, the binary gender options, the she or the he, it takes on, it kind of changes shape what that means. And so I was thinking about that in the context of things like pronoun go-rounds that are becoming increasingly common, how the meaning of volunteering she or he will take a different meaning in a new context in which they and other pronouns are more frequent.
Mm-hmm. Was there a question in there, or is it just like, this is cool and I like it?
No, I was wondering, sorry. I was wondering if you further thoughts on that, if that's something that you've seen any work that will start, kind of exploring in that direction, or if that was more of just a brief idea.
So one of the other reasons that I've been maintaining this Google Doc is because so much of the work that's being done on this stuff right now is being done as undergraduate thesis work or term papers or generals papers where people haven't qualified for their candidacy in their PhD program. So a lot of the work is student work, and it's really hard to track down. So what I will tell you is there's probably stuff on this, but it's not in formal peer-reviewed journals yet. It's too new. And so one of the things that if I were trying to track down, especially stuff about pronoun sharing practices and how that influences the way that pronouns sort of take on extra meanings, I would go look at sort of anthropological studies of educational settings as my first sort of attempt. Or looking at theses from people getting their degrees in education and stuff like this, because that's where a lot of this work is sort of happening on the ground. And I think one of the real challenges to bringing it into sort of formal linguistics research is finding out who is writing these theses and being like, can you please get in our Google Doc with us? Because they're not linguists always, but it's frequently very relevant to linguists.
Okay, I think we better hard leave it there because it's 8:30 now, so I'll wrap up. I'd like to thank again Dr. Kirby Conrod for a really wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Lots of people in the chat have said how much they've enjoyed it and what a good talk it's been. If anybody wants more Kirby, then the latest episode of the Lingthusiasm podcast, which you should all listen to anyway, but you should especially listen to the most recent one, episode 43, which is out now, is an interview with Kirby, which isn't exactly the same things as they've said today. It's different stuff. So you can go and fill your boots with all the Kirby you want. Kirby's also on Twitter. Is it just your name? I forget.
It is, yeah. Here, I have it on my first slide.
Excellent.
And I unlocked very special this week, so people can actually look at my tweets.
Ooh.
There it is.
So yeah, and I'm Linguist Laura on Twitter. If you want to know when we do the next one of these talks, we hope to do more Zoom talks, which we'll make open to everybody as we have done this one. And I'd just like to thank you all once again for coming today. And I'm going to end.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really, really fun. And I really appreciate all your questions. These were really great questions. So thank you everybody who showed up on a Friday night for this.
Yes. Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.